at the Posey House, which is one of the 9 historic buildings here in downtown Corden that was here during the Capitol time. It was built in 1817 by Colonel Thomas Posey. Let's go inside and start our loom lesson. My name is Lydia Robertson, and I'm going to teach you about some of the looms that we have that have been donated to the Historical Society. First, I'm going to teach you how to warp, which is the long ropes that go down that you weave in between. I'll teach you how to measure those out for the loom, then actually thread the loom, and then I'll actually work on the loom a bit to show you the whole process. And then after all of that, we have an old loom that it was donated by the Rothrock family that is has been in the family for many generations, and I will be showing you the intricacies of that. That one is not a working loom currently, so I'm going to teach you on this one, and then we'll see that one. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to be measuring the warp for the loom. And as I said, the warp is the long vertical stretches that you weave in between. So it's important when choosing a material for weaving that you get some kind of twine that is not elastic. You can use yarn and cut up pieces of fabric for weaving in between, but the warp that is strung through the loom needs to be cotton or something that doesn't stretch. What I am going to be using is some regular crochet thread, but you can use many different things. First, you're going to tie a loop and attach it to the top of the warp board. This helps you measure how long of a warp and make sure all of your strings are the same length. From one side of the warp board to the other is a yard, so you know however many times you wrap it, that's how much yardage you have. Now, my loom is already threaded, so I'm just going to make about a 3-yard warp to add to the loom to show you how to attach it, even though there's already warp on there. So first, you attach it up here, the loop around the top, go over the first one, and under the second one, and back over the top. Then you're going to loop around, and since I'm only going to do 3, that is my first yard right there from beginning to this end. Then I'm going to go down to this next one, that's a 2nd yard, and then down to the 3rd one. I'm going to skip this one just so it's not so tight. I don't need a lot of pegs because I'm not making a really long warp. But then after the 3rd one, I'm just going to turn around and start going back up. So those are my first 2 warps. That's 1 yard, 2 yard, 3 yard, 4 yards, 5 yards. And then on my way back, I am going to wrap it the same way until I get to the top. The top, I'm going to go over this one and under this one. That'll create an X right there between the 2nd and 3rd peg from the start. That is very important because that helps you to keep your first string and your 2nd string differentiated from each other. I'm going to wrap that off, keep the tension a little bit, and then make sure everything is on there good. You don't want it super tight tension. See, there's a lot of bounce there, but you want to make sure that it's always the same tension. You want to make sure if you start loose, you go loose the whole time. If you start tight, keep the same tension the whole time so you get as close to the exact same length as you possibly can. And then before I continue on to do my 3rd and 4th warp, I'm going to push all of these back to the back of the peg so I have room to work the rest of the measurements. And also to make it more convenient so I don't have to hold this the whole time, I'm going to use my nifty little creation here, box with a knitting needle through it, and that helps just unwind the string as I go. I am going to make 21 3-yard stretches, and I will show you I need 6 to make an inch. Now I have 6 warps. I've wrapped it down 3 times and back up 3 times. So I'm going to take a brightly colored piece of yarn to differentiate. That's where my X is of 6 warps. I'm going to put it like that, and then I'm going to do 6 more and cross these back and front, and that measures out each inch to make sure that you have the correct measurements. I'm going to make 20 of these. Now that I am done measuring out my warps, I'm ready to remove them from the warp board. But before I do that, I want to anchor them, make sure that they don't get all tangled up, because that defeats the whole purpose of the warp board. So I have my pink counting thread that is woven between each group of 6, so each inch. We're going to leave that on there, and I'm just going to tie it in a bow so it stays and keeps those separated the entire time. I've also cut 8 or so other pieces of thread to tie periodically through the section as well. There are some key points too that you need to tie, and then you also just want some to secure the big sections. First, we're going to tie on the top and bottom of each side of our cross section. So we're going to tie those separately. The top section, I'm going to loop it around twice, and then do a simple bow that is easy to untie later. We're going to do the same thing on the top over here. Going to wrap it around twice, pull it tight, tie a bow. And then on the bottom of each of these sections as well. These are the 4 most important ties, or I guess 5 most important ties. This is the most important section of your warp, because this is the part where you differentiate the top and bottom and how it will be threaded through the loom. And then once you thread it through this way, the rest of the length will follow as if you have threaded your loom properly. All right, now the next most important section of the warp, we have the cross section all tied tightly. We're going to tie both ends of the warp to keep those so we know where the ends are. Going to tie that off tightly as well with a bow that can be either cut or untied fairly easily, and then move down here to the far end of the warp. Now that I have these tied, those are the most important places to tie, but I don't want to leave a big section in between with nothing tied in between. Right now, you're at about 2.5 yards that has nothing tying it together. So I'm going to use the remainder of these strings that I've cut to just make a clump right here, about 1 every yard or so. So since I only did 3 yards, got 1 tie there, have 1 tie here, and 1 tie down here at the bottom. That way, that should be able to keep it from getting too hectic when you take it off. And that is my complete warp. I'm going to take it off of the board momentarily, and then I will lay it flat and we'll get on talking about the actual loom and the pieces or the parts of it and how we thread it. Now that we have finished measuring and wrapping our warp, I'm going to talk a little bit about the loom and the different parts of it before we actually get into dressing the loom and working on it. So this is our loom that we have at the Posey House. It was donated to the Historical Society of Harrison County from Linda Schultz earlier this year, and it is the one that I will be working on today, and then later on in the video I will be showing the Rothrock's. First, I want to point out all the different pieces and what they do. So we'll start at the front and the bottom. Down here we have our petals. There are 6 of them. We're only going to be using 2 because we're going to do a basic up down like regular weaving pattern. There are 6 and you can do a more intricate pattern. I personally am not that advanced yet, and that'd be a lot of work to put into this video before being able to get it out. So we have our 2 petals and they are attached where they need to be attached. I'll show you that in a minute. We have this petal which releases the back beam where the warp is attached, and we have this lever that is attached to this front beam. The front beam is a cloth roller where the front end of the warp is tied on, and your working pieces will go down and wrap around that and eventually get cut off whenever you're done. This controls the tightness for the front. This one controls the tightness for the back. Then we have this. You will be sitting here, or I will be sitting here. This is the beater bar where you're working right here in this section of the loom, and you bring this down and it beats against that bar, and that is what controls the tightness of the weave. This is the beater, what you actually physically pull to make it tight, and it also holds in the reeds. The reed is what determines the size of your woven piece. Whenever I was wrapping the warp, I said that we needed 6 per inch. That's because of the spacing in each of these reeds. 6 spaces equal 1 inch. You can get them where they're more tightly woven and you get 12 in an inch, but the one that I have is 6. Then we'll move back here. This, the warp then goes up through the heddles. Again, we're going to do a simple 1 up, 1 down pattern. So this is what physically moves up and down to control the level of the warp to where this is to allow an opening for your weaving to go through. These are what is attached to the petals underneath. If I had these extra petals attached, I could do a more intricate pattern, but I'm not ready for that today, and I want to get this going so I can show you how it works. So we're going to continue moving back. Our warp then goes back around this back beam onto the back warp beam. This is where all of the warp that you make, all of the pre-warp that you haven't worked yet comes from. This is where I have about 15 yards from this warp, and then I will be adding the 3 yards that we just measured out today. And to release it, I will step on that pedal from the beginning and crank that hand crank to turn the front beam to get the tightness and the length that I want. So those are the different parts of the loom. We'll go through, I'll lace everything up and show you how that works, and then we'll get working on it. Now we are going to dress the loom, now that we've gone over the different parts. Normally this is where the working pieces would be, where the rugs would be strung. Since I already have the loom dressed, we're just going to pretend those are there and move on to the back to use the warp that we made earlier to dress it. In order to dress it, you need the warp, you need a roll of paper or fabric. Usually you use paper, it doesn't catch as much, and then 2 boards, or these are balsa wood. They're called Lee sticks. You can order them online. These I just bought at Joann's, and you can make your own. And I'll show you how to use those and how to dress the loom. Now we have everything wound completely to the front, and we're at the back end of the working warp, and we're going to transfer into that purple warp that I just made. So the first thing we need to do is we need to put leaf sticks into this warp so we can differentiate the the warp that's through this and the warp that's through this. So I'm going to do that by stepping on one of the petals, which raises up half of the warp and lowers the other half. And I'm going to take one of my leaf sticks and just thread it through there and pull it up towards the end. And then I'm going to step on the other petal, which will reverse the warp that is pulled up. And I'm going to thread that through and pull that up tight with the other one. Now this has all of the warps evenly separated to where I can differentiate which goes through which heddle. I am done with that, and I'm going to move on now to the back part and untie this warp before I tie on the first warp. Now I don't want to untie everything at the same time. It'll all fall out and be a bit hectic. So I'm going to start at this end. We don't have to worry about doing them in sections of 6 or inch sections anymore because we've already worked them. So we just need to pull them off, untie them, or cut them. So now that we have the leaf sticks in, I'm going to start cutting these individual sections of the warp that is already dressed onto the loom. And then I will tie them up close to the leaf sticks so that holds them in. You don't have to tie them in inch sections or cut them in inch sections. They're just still kind of divided up like that, so that's how I'm going to do it. So now that we have the old warp, the worked warp, pulled up to the front of the heddles to keep the tension on it, we are going to dress the new warp back here onto the warp wheel and get it working through. First thing we need to do is take 2 long pieces of string, and we are going to tie slings around this part here, the attachment of the warp board or the warp wheel, and that just holds it up in place and some tension. Gonna tie 1 on each end, and we're gonna get our dowel that we put our warp on, and we are going to get our warp, and this is where we bring in the new warp that we made. We're going to take the end, the beginning of the warp closest to where we tied, or we did the counting ties, and we're going to lay it over the loom, put the dowel through the slings that we just made and through the beginning of the warp, back through the sling. And now that that is on the loom, we can start untying or cutting all of these warp strings that we put in to hold them together. We're going to start with the less important ones here down towards the end that we're just holding the main clump together. And at the very end is when we're going to take out the counting string and the ones that are tying the cross section. Going to untie the first one. We are not going to cut the warp on this end. We're going to use the loop at the beginning of the warp. All right, now I'm going to untie the counting thread. So the counting thread was where that X was in our warp, but because we have these 4 ties, we still have that X clearly in our warp. Now this is important. We don't want to lose that X. If we do, then we have to go through and individually figure out where each piece crosses before we tie it into the next thread. So we are going to get 2 more lease sticks. Okay, so now before we put the lease sticks into the warp, we are going to tie the warp rod into the warp wheel. There are these ties that are attached to the warp wheel itself, but instead of threading the dowel through there, I am going to tie these in. I do that just because these will then be more adjustable later. I'm not going to tie every single string right now because I will have to move these around as I space out the warp. And nor am I tying a super tight knot. Okay. Going to take my warp. I'm going to pull it up over this whole bar for now to pull some tension on that warp pull that I just tied. It is now, instead of hanging in the slings, it is held onto by these ties that I just did. So we have some tension, just a little bit, not too tight. Now, instead of putting the lease sticks in, I've decided I'm going to use some string instead. It'll serve the same purpose, but the lease sticks, there's weight to them, and that might pull one side to the other and have them fall out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a long, about 3 foot long strand in between where these ropes are tied, so that keeps the differentiation between the top and bottom, and then another one up here at the top. And then I'm going to untie these knots that are holding together the warp in that X. But since I have that one, that should keep from it falling out and losing track of the cross section. Okay, so those are untied. Now what we're going to do is I am going to start tying, those weren't important, start tying the purple warp to the white warp. Before I do that, I'm going to spread this purple warp out along the warp dowel. That's why I tied these loosely, so I can move some over and retie in between. You don't have to worry about spacing exactly apart or where the exact middle is, especially since I already have a warp on there. If I was dressing this loom from scratch with nothing already on it, it would be more important to figure out where your middle is and where everything was. But since I already have a warp on that, the old warp will guide my new warp through all of the heddles and keep everything straight as long as it is spaced relatively towards the center. So I'm going to untie those two middle ones and scoot out this way, making sure not to let that the warp fall through that thread that I put in there to use as my lease. Spread out this way. All right, and then I am going to start tying the long end of the warp, or the far end of the warp, to the old warp. So what I need to do, let's get this spread out. I'm going to tie these back down, and I am going to wrap the warp around the warp wheel until I am close to the end of the warp and can tie the two ends together. As you wind the warp wheel, you're going to, I'm going to put in a roll of paper. You can use just cut open paper grocery bags, or I bought a roll of like construction paper from the craft store. That keeps the strings from laying on top of each other, getting tangled up, or knots forming from one layer to the other. Now I am going to start winding the warp onto the warp board. This is gonna be a delicate process, so we'll go ahead and I'll show how we go. We have to move the lease ties up as we go, so we keep that X going with us all the way to the end. We're gonna start turning the warp wheel, making sure it's straight as we go, because if it's not, then there will be more tension on one end of the warp than there is the other. We're going to move these up, spread them back out. Now before we start winding the warp onto the warp roll, we're going to keep these lease threads in, these lease anchors, but we're also going to put the lease boards in through as well. The anchors will help ensure that the board, that we do not lose the cross section, and the lease boards will help us move the cross section up as we wind. So we're going to make sure we get our two parts divided up. And going through at the right section and put it through. Alright, it looks a bit hectic now, and there's certainly probably more organized ways to do it, but this is the way that I've learned. So now we are going to start winding our warp onto our warp spool. So just to do that, we're going to want to keep some tension on the warp that we will be winding, and we're going to wind the wheel. We want to make sure that everything is relatively straight. We don't want any big angles, If there is an angle, then one side will be tighter than the other. So we're gonna keep that going. As the lease gets to there, we are going to move the lease sticks up and move that cross section up. This is a bit hard to do because that is where every single one of these 100 strings is crossing. But that's why we have the sticks. That helps move the whole thing up as we go and make sure we don't lose that cross section. Before we start winding again, I'm going to make sure these are spread out. Because again, it doesn't have to be perfectly spread every inch by inch. But if it's all tight like this, then that will cause a problem when it has to come through the heddles later. Gonna keep rolling. And make sure that that cross section keeps moving up. Again, that string is to make sure that this lease stick doesn't fall out and we lose everything. And the wood is to keep it moving. We're going to do that all the way to close to the other end of the warp.
Yeah.
Now that I've completed tying all the warps together, I am ready to pull out the lease sticks and then get the warps working through the loom itself. Now, if you were just dressing a loom from the very beginning with no pre-dress on it, you would have to take the additional step. You wouldn't have the strings to tie it to. You would have to thread each of the individual pieces of the warp through the heddle and the reed. Usually once you have dressed a loom once, you do it like this and just use your remaining warp from the previous project to pull it through. It takes a long time, but it actually takes less time to do that than to thread through the individual pieces. So I'm going to pull these lease sticks out. They're no longer needed because they were just keeping the cross section in my string, and now that the string is tied in, it already has that tied in there. Okay, now that we have the loom dressed, this is where we put all the tension into the warp. So we have the warp coming through and we're going to tie it onto this dowel. We're going to start with the middle section. I have the middle portion of the warp marked there. I'm going to take a middle section, doesn't have to be exactly an inch. This one happens to be 6 strings, so it is. And I'm going to tie it around the dowel. You start in the middle because the middle is usually where there is the most slack and where you want it to be the tightest. So I'm going to tie 1/2 of a square knot on the top to hold it in place. Get it as tight as I can. And then before I finish off that square knot, I'm going to work my way out to each side. And then I'm going to come back to the middle and tighten it again and finish off the square knot, which will make all of them roughly the same tension throughout the loom. This is one of the most important steps because if you have loose strings in your warp, then you won't be able to weave in between. Now I have all of the warp tied off and I am ready to start working. Before I start weaving the fabric through, I am going to put in these planks that I used as lease sticks earlier, and that helps to keep the tension and measure out your ends. which usually people tie on their rugs at the end. So I'm going to step on one of the petals and send one of the boards through and pull it all the way down. And then I'm going to step on the other petal, send the next board through, and pull that down. Now, this is a good chance to check and make sure everything is woven properly, that you didn't skip any of the reeds or the heddles as you came through. And this also helps kind of space out the warp before you start weaving as well. I'm actually going to do all 4 at the beginning before I start doing fabric to help this space out and get the tension right. And then I will start weaving with some pink fabric. Now we have 4 in. All of the tension is pretty even and there's not very many spaces, and those will all work out as we go. I'm going to make a couple of rolls to get the working part down here where I can actually reach it, and then we will start. Alright, so now the tension is tight, those sticks are in, and we can start weaving. Gonna find the end of my fabric, step down on one of the petals, open up the warp where I can stick the shuttle in between, go all the way through. Now I'm not going to pull to the very end because I'm going to want to weave this end in as well. So now that we have the working area here at table height and distance from us, we're going to start weaving. So I'm going to push down on one of the petals. That will open up this area between the 2 warps, and I will feed my shuttle of fabric through. I'm going to pull it through and rest it back on my lap. I'm not going to pull the tail all the way to the very tip because I'm going to leave a little bit out to weave in later. Then I'm going to take the beater bar, which is holding the reeds in, and beat that down a couple of times. Switch the petal, give it another beat, and then do the same process. I'm on the second petal now, so the opposite warps are up than earlier, so I'm going to come back through, rest the shuttle back on my lap, and pull it through. I want to make sure at the end on this side as well, I don't pull it tight. If you pull it tight, then your rug or your piece will start curving in like that. You're going to leave it fairly loose over there. Looser than you think, and it'll work its way in and actually be the correct tension. You're also going to take this tail from the very beginning, and you're going to hide that back in here along with this one. You're going to want that tail to stick up so you can cut it off, or some people like leaving it out. So I have that, my second pass through. I'm going to pull the beater bar back down again, switch petals, give it another knock, and then shuttle through again. This is the Rothrock Loom, and it has been in the family since the 1850s. The Rothrocks immigrated to the United States in 1736 from Germany, and there are 3 different branches of the Rothrock family that are in the area. They're all descendants from Peter Rothrock, Peter and Margaret Rothrock. The Solomon family is the ones that had this loom. There was Henry Peter, he's the family that I am descendant from, and then there was Mary. Solomon had 9 children, Henry Peter had 12, and Mary had 1, and all of the Rothrocks that are in the Harrison County and Crawford County areas are all descended from them. So if you want more details about the Rothrock genealogy, I'm going to post those in the description of the video. But we're going to look at the loom now. I'm going to point out some of the similarities and differences with the Rothrock loom to the loom that we worked on earlier.
Okay.
As you can see, this loom is quite a bit bigger than the other loom. As I said, it was made hundreds of years ago, so it was a lot harder to produce a smaller loom. These are all big solid pieces of timber that they put together. Back here we have the warp beam with the warp on it. Unfortunately, the loom is not operational right now because in transportation all the warps got tangled up. It has multiple hundreds, I think it's 250 last time I counted, warp strings in here for me to untangle and rethread. Also, the heddles got broken. There was no heddle piece with this loom. It was strung with individual strings for the heddles, so I'm remaking those and have to make enough to get the warps through. Then they go up here through the reed, which is very similar to the other loom that we're using, except it attaches at the top rather than the bottom. And then goes around the breastboard. The seat is built into this loom. And those are the general pieces of the loom, similar to the original loom, or the first loom that you saw me working on. I hope you learned a lot about the looms in this video, and if you are interested in more of the Rothrock genealogy, as I said, I will put that in the description of the video. Thank you very much.